Uh, that was weird. The thing immediately, like, I gotta fix something with OBS's settings because my webcam keeps doing funky crap. So I don't know why it keeps doing that. Just let me know anytime like the camera goes out of sync like that. I'll try and fix it. It's annoying. It annoys me so much. It was so annoying yesterday. So hopefully it doesn't keep being a problem. The good news is I think I fixed my microphone problem. It was a wiring problem. So when I fixed the wiring, and like the connections and all that stuff, it it stopped being much of a problem. I still like think in the end I might need a new wire altogether, but for the most part, it's fixed. I'm just gonna fix the lighting. I'm just looking at the playback, and the lighting looks awful. I don't know why the lighting is so bad today. Okay, I'm just testing the um, camera thing. There's like a slight delay. I'm gonna fix it one last time. Hopefully it stops being a problem. I don't know why the webcam is being wonky with me again. I just hope it stops. Oh God, make it stop, right? Ah, anyway. Oh, that can't be good. I just overheard that like they wanted to play with the cat a little bit and make her run around. But that means there'll be a lot of noise. If there is a lot of noise in the background, it's the cat, and sorry about that. Anyway, hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson reads the Gospel of Mark. And today we are going to cover chapters 5 and 6 today. I'll be using the New International Version, or NIV, with some Streaming Parson abridged. If you, I encourage you guys to follow along. You know, use like if you have a Bible on hand, or you know, just go the easy way and use like the internet, because I mean, Bible Gateway is a reliable site where you just like boom, free Bible. Just do that. uh, I'll give you a second to flip to the page or to the chapter, and we'll start off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll just jump right into it. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read through the Gospels, I just pray you would continue revealing yourself to us and illuminating our minds to know you more. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so Mark chapter 5. So, um, just a little bit of quick recap of the previous chapters. So, we're still pretty early in Jesus's ministry, and one of the underlying tones of the story, I guess you could say, is that after Jesus has done like a couple miracles here and there, he's done some healings, he's driven out some demons and whatever. The question then comes of, who is this guy? Who is this Jesus, and how is he able to do the stuff that he does? And I mean that to us as a modern reader, the answers are kind of already played out, and of course, like, the cultural zeitgeist, you should, like, okay, we know that Jesus is the Messiah, but the people in the story, they don't really know. And those who kind of can piece things together, there's also this level of uh, well, there's several things. So first, there's obviously like doubt, and that's because people are naturally skeptical. And I remember, if you've heard my rants on like Fire Emblem Engage and why I think the story is just god awful in that game, is because in Fire Emblem Engage, the characters don't act like real people. And I even, like, just to sound edgy, I always mention that like the characters in Fire Emblem Engage, they act like a cult, in like the negative sense of the word, not like cult culture. Because yes, we get the word culture from cult, but uh, like they act like, like a backwater town cult in Fire Emblem Engage. And I pointed this out in the sense of like how in Fire Emblem Engage, when Alira's going around parading, I'm the Divine Dragon, which is not something you do. You don't just tell everyone that, flat out that you're, the divine figure of the story. It just kind of is not a good idea practically. And there's two dimensions to this. The first is that obviously you don't know who your enemies are, so you don't want to be giving away your position to make it easier for your enemies to attack you. And secondly, uh, in real life, if someone went around saying that they were the Messiah, people would naturally be very skeptical. And, hashtag terrible pastor moment. But if there was a person walking around and they were claiming to be like, I'm Jesus returned, right? The natural instinct in us would be to doubt that. And that's why, you've heard me say so many times, that's all the more reason why I always keep studying the scriptures. That's why we were given the scriptures, is so that anytime any kind of like claim is made, if you will, you always check with scripture. I'm a big believer of that, and a big reason is because there's been like cults and stuff around that, like, people claiming they're Jesus returned or whatever, or some other crazy heretical belief about, like, I remember there used to be like a cult in Korea about how there was a guy claiming to be like the descendant of Jesus and stuff like that. And you hear stuff like that, and the natural human inclination is to doubt, because humans are like that. That's human reflex. It's a survival thing that we as humans have developed. Evolution, an evolutionary development that humans have, is that we question everything because it's a survival tactic. And so, going back to making fun of Fire Emblem Engage, when characters don't even question, and even worse, a lot of characters just like fall into line when like Alira's going around being like, I'm the Divine Dragon. It's like, no, that's not how people would act. And that's why it was just like, it was really easy to like become disengaged. Ironic that you become disengaged with engaged because of how out of how not realistic characters act in that game. And so, uh, what does this got to do with the Bible? Well, I always contrast it to the Bible. And when you read like through the Gospels, and even though Jesus doesn't outright say, like those exact words that I am the Messiah or I am God or anything like that, he never says it outright. Um, Jesus does the whole meme of like how to say something without actually saying it. And there's a number of times where Jesus will attribute himself um, the title of like other believed to be divine figures, the Son of Man being the big one, which he did twice in chapter 2. And of course, there's other things where Jesus claims certain authority when he heals a man with leprosy, I think is in chapter 1. And in that story, the guy's like, if you will, you can heal me, which first of all, the guy with leprosy, that would have been like, that guy would have been acting pretty heretical to ask a human to act like God. So that was already pretty heretical. And then Jesus continues the heresy, if you will, by saying like, yes, I will. And that's one way Jesus was basically claiming that he in fact is God, because he's assuming that authority onto himself. And so there's moments like that where Jesus is basically more or less claiming he is God without saying he's God. But then of course you have a lot of people question the Pharisees, Jesus' own disciples even. They question uh, Jesus' identity. And I mean, on the one hand, it's like rightfully so, because that's how real people would act. Uh, and I made that point earlier. If there was a person going around claiming they were the Messiah, you would naturally question that. And as I always say, that's why studying the scriptures is so important. Is because there'd be a lot of people claiming to be like, especially in like times nowadays, with how rough things are. Uh, there's a lot of people claiming like, oh, like the end times is this particular date, and or something about like, you hear people saying like, oh, they're, you know, the answer to like the crises, and claiming like a divine headship. Um, you the natural human reflection is, or sorry, the natural human reaction is to doubt and then go back to scripture and check. And that's why, you guys hear me say this all the time. That's why it's so important to study the scriptures. Don't, even with all the stuff I say, no matter how smart it sounds, I always tell you guys like, read it for yourself. Don't just take my word for anything. Because I'm, at the end of the day, I'm just some guy, right? So I am not a divine authority. So uh, even anything I say, you always question it. And so that that is a running theme that we've run into so far in the Gospel of Mark, is that you have to check with scripture, because even when Jesus was doing a lot of claims and people were doubtful, and of course the reason why Jesus does the ministry the way he does it is to affirm that, like, yes, everything I do is in line with the word, because in the book of Matthew, uh, there's the famous line that Jesus says, um, I've not come to dismantle or to disprove uh, the word of God. I've come to uh, complete the writings of the prophets and of the law. And so basically there's that whole controversy that people always have about like how just because Jesus gives us the new covenant, does that do away with the Old Testament? And the answer is no. Jesus is the fulfillment of that. You hear that language a lot in Christian rhetoric. And the idea is that even everything Jesus himself does is in line with the Word of God, with the Old Testament. And so there's this interesting dynamic going on. And of course, we have the advantage of the resurrection already occurring, and secondly, the Holy Spirit empowering theologians for the last 2,000 years to have a much more intimate knowledge of of the writing of Scripture and the New Testament writings. We have a lot more intimate knowledge, if you will. Whereas, like, to be fair to these first century Israelites, they would not have known that. They wouldn't have that at their disposal. So it'd be unfair to be like, oh, look how stupid these people are, not being able to catch on Jesus' euphemisms and stuff like that. Okay, like, yeah, we also have to be very wise about that and not just criticize people for disadvantages um, that were evident that we clearly don't have. It's think of it as, I mean, a way of thinking of it is like, don't be that smart ass who thinks like, well, why, you know, why couldn't like uh medieval warfare be so much easier and not as dirty, but that's because they didn't have modern weapons technology. Medieval fighting was a very uh, crass way of doing things. Or comparing even like modern technology to like World War I, and World War I was known to be one of the worst, bloodiest wars because of how sloppy everything is. So like people just like die left and right to like the stupidest crap because military training as we have it now didn't exist. Weapons tech didn't exist, right? So it was like it's unfair to compare like, okay, World War I with like modern day warfare and stuff like that, because time, there are time advantages that we have in the 21st century. So it's unfair to look down upon how primitive, if you will, uh, a lot of people in earlier times were. And especially that's true as we read through the Gospels and you look at like the first century Israelites and how stupid they act. It's unfair to judge them harshly because they didn't have the advantages that we have now. So that's kind of the preamble I had before we actually dive into Mark chapter 5. All right, here we go. Mark chapter 5. So they went across, Jesus and his disciples, went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tomb to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. Nobody was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In the name of God, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." So Jesus asked him, "What's your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again to not send him out of the area. So a large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside, and the demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs and allow us to go into them." Jesus gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd was about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake, and drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind. And the people were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and they told them about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus didn't let him go, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how much he had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. Verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she got worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "Even if I touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At that moment, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding around you?" his disciples answered. "And yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear. She told him the truth, and Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher any more?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He didn't let anyone follow him except for Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child isn't dead, but is asleep." But the people laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, get up, I say." So immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. Alright, so that was chapter 5. We have like 3 stories. One of them's pretty short, but basically we have 3 events that happen. So the first is one of the more well-known parts, I guess, of Jesus' ministry and his miracles. And so this story is about some guy who's demon possessed. He's often referred to as the demoniac in a lot of Christian traditions. And so this guy, he's basically like hangs around like tombs and stuff like that, and just acts all freaky. And the people don't know what to do with this guy, because apparently they can't like put him in a prison. He just break out. They can't even overpower him, because I guess he's got like some superhuman strength of some kind. And so the people are just like, "I'll just leave him in the wilderness and hopefully he stops being a problem." Which, when you think about it that way, it's very telling of how people deal, I guess. That's a poor choice of words, but it's how people deal with the spiritual matters, I guess. We talk about like, how do I say? Okay, how do I word this without it sounding like super condescending. But when we as a society, we tend to want to push everything that's like spiritually related. We just, put it, just put it somewhere out there and just hope it just stops being a problem. That's kind of the modern attitude, especially in North America. Well, the West. So like Europe has this problem, obviously. North America, uh, it's a big problem here, where basically when it comes to spirituality and dealing with, uh, I mean, the Bible gives an extreme case of like someone else being demon possessed, but even when it comes to things like our own spiritual health and just dealing with that part of yourself and all the influences that come upon it, we tend to downplay it a lot, and we kind of put we as a culture have trained ourselves to be like, okay, put spirituality over there and hope it just stops being a problem. This is where you get like one of the big transitions of, for instance, our attitudes towards sex is a big example of this. You get like, ever since the sexual revolution, you get that rhetoric of like, well, sex is just a physical thing, which it isn't. Uh, Sex is a emotion. It's like, back in the day when uh, when I was younger, the funny euphemism we'd always use when like talk about like people doing the hanky panky, we call it like spiritual bonding. So it's like, oh, they're doing some spiritual bonding, and the reason was because most people were aware, uh, and most people who aren't just people lying to you and telling you having a high body count isn't a problem because sex is just a physical transaction. Which, if you think about it, one of the I think that's a big problem in our culture, where we've kind of uh, commodified sex, which sounds so messed up, but I mean it is. But that's also why like people's attitudes toward it nowadays is just like so like down the shitter basically. Is because we've removed that spiritual element out of sex, along with the emotional and mental uh, aspects of it. Yeah, I know that sounds weird to say out loud, but once we've cut off a lot of like the spiritual, mental, and emotional aspects, we kind of push it to those things of sexuality to like go over there and stop being a problem. And I mean, I just use sex as the example, but this is true in all kinds of things. When we think of anything that affects our inner being, and I know the religious rhetoric is like the spiritual side of ourselves and how things affect that, and um, we we as modern people don't like having that discussion. We just kind of like put it away somewhere and just hope it stops being a problem. But in the book of Mark, there's this little bit here where it's like, no, that doesn't really work. Clearly, this is gonna keep being a problem, just because you want to live under that whole out of sight, out of mind. There are some things you can't just put out of sight and have it out of mind. That's not how it is in more important matters, especially spiritual ones. You can't just hope it stays away just because you don't see it. And an easy way of thinking about this is like, okay, like bad things happen all over the world. It doesn't not it doesn't stop being an issue just because we live in the comforts of North America and don't have to see it. That's not how it is. Uh, Injustices do exist. Uh, you hear this rhetoric all the time, especially when like people talk about like systemic racism. That's another good example to kind of poke at. It doesn't stop being a problem just because it's like, oh, put it over there, and then hope it stops being a problem. No, right? It doesn't happen like that. It keeps being a problem because it exists, not because you. And it doesn't stop being a problem just because you put it outside of your peripherals and don't think about it. Uh, that's not how life is. And so, uh, You feel better about it though. I mean, Tom, that is but I mean, that's the justification of why we do it. We tend to think it's like, oh, I feel better. Uh, at least in the moment, that may be true. Well, it is true in the moment. I shouldn't say it might be true. It is true in the moment, but you have to you have to think about your life like, the entirety of it. And so it may feel fine at the moment, but we can't keep pushing aside like our spiritual issues along with like emotional and mental and all the other ones. But when it comes to spiritual issues, you can't just put it away somewhere and just hope it stops being a problem. Because clearly, as we read here, that was the attitude of the people. That's how they treated uh, problems, if you will, embodied in this demon possessed person. You can't just it won't stop being a problem just because you don't want it to be until it is actually solved. Then it stops being a problem, which is exactly what Jesus does. Also, welcome to the stream, Tom. But that's exactly what Jesus does. He comes in and he solves the problem. Of course, there's the interesting detail about how uh, Jesus doesn't like destroy the demon. It's kind of an interesting thing he does. In the Mark account, it's not. There's a lot less dialogue between Jesus and the demon. In the Mark account, the dialogue is very minimal. It's just like Jesus tells demon, get out of this guy. Demon says, don't just send us away. And then Jesus goes, what's your name? We are Legion. All right, what do you want? Demon goes, well, we don't want you to. Well, no, sorry, that's in the Matthew account. In the Mark account, the dialogue continues. Okay, after he learns the name, he goes, okay, um, what's gonna convince me to not like obliterate you guys? And then the demons go, you see those pigs over there? Let us possess the pigs. Jesus goes, oh, okay, fine. Uh, you can do that. And then the demons do that, and then that's kind of the end of the scene. The demons go and drown themselves. In the Matthew account, there's actually a little bit of added dialogue where the demons first ask Jesus, what are you doing here so soon? Have you come to torture us before sending us to the abyss? And what's interesting about that bit of dialogue, which is not explored in Mark, because once again, Mark, the way that Mark escalates the story, if you will, is a lot more of a slow burn because it's not like this immediate. Uh, well, part of it maybe because since Mark is written earlier than Matthew, there would not have been as much eschatological talk in like the Markan uh, like circles of churches, I guess you could say, and the way that the Mark account goes, there's a lot less eschatology. Eschatology, for those of you who don't know, is like talk of like the end times kind of thing. And, well, that's not necessarily true. We associate eschatology with the end times. Eschatology actually refers to the quote unquote fulfillment of the Christian ministry and the role of the church, if you will. And then, of course, by transient of logic, when the job is done, you're at the end time. That's kind of how that's the logic. The logic that Christians use is once the job of the church is done, then that's when all the end time stuff occurs. In the book of Mark, that's not really important. In the book of Matthew, there's a lot of discourses about what happens when like the work of the mission the is over. There's a lot of talk about that and people speculating about it, and that's why you have stuff like the Olivet Discourse. That's why you have, um, well, the Olivet Discourse being the big one. You have like certain like parables of Jesus talking about like the sheep and the goats. One, you have the path to death is wide, but the path of life is narrow. You have a lot of that kind of discourse in the book of Matthew because the question that would have been around during later parts of the first century, and definitely by the time the book of Matthew was written, people would have asked a lot more about that because, of course, you know, they're with one of the major uh, doctrines emphasized in the book of Matthew would have been the Great Commission. You know, go make disciples of all nations. The book of Mark is not that concerned with that because, once again, as I mentioned in the first stream, the book of Mark, all it cares about is just like, here are the events of some of Jesus's ministry. These are the events. There's no heavy theological discussion in the book of Mark as opposed to Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke are very heavy in theological discussion. As I mentioned before, if you go through my Luke series, the big thesis of Luke is the idea of what does it mean to be spiritually empowered, if you will, by the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's kind of the question. And how do we embody that resurrection life? And of course, there's the whole discourse of like the Holy Spirit teaching us and moving us forward, empowering us to, you know, to live good Christian lives and all that stuff. The book of Matthew is concerned with going out and making disciples, and of course, what happens when that's done. And that's why in the book of Matthew, there's a lot more discussion of, like, quote unquote, the end times compared to the other gospels. And of course, with that said, in the Matthew version of the demoniac encounter, there's an added line about the demons asking, like, they're asking Jesus, have you come to torture us before the end? And of course, there's like this implication about how the demons already know how the end is going to play. They already know. But then, of course, the demons are kind of scared of, like, maybe Jesus has like a sadistic side to him, that he's gonna mess with them in the present as opposed to waiting till the end times. So there's that whole difference in the book of Matthew, and that's why that difference exists. I thought it'd be important to bring it up because I know the book of Mark doesn't really care about that, and so that's why it's not brought up, and that's why that discrepancy exists. So that's why the dialogue between Jesus and Legion is very minimal in the book of Mark. Because, once again, the book of Mark just like, okay, this happened. They talk for a bit, and then Jesus allows the demons to enter a bunch of pigs. And then the demons are so scared. Oh yeah, the reason why I brought up the whole Matthew discourse is that the demons are so scared of Jesus that they'd rather go into a physical body and drown themselves than to deal with anything that Jesus could do to torture them, quote unquote. Which, if you think about it, that's got to be pretty scary then. Yeah, I'd rather be in a disgusting animal body and drown myself than to deal with any kind of torture that God could possibly come up with. Which is quite telling if you think about it. And so, with that said, Jesus exorcises the demons, but he's actually pretty light about it. And it kind of brings this weird thing, like this weird kind of paradox, if you will. It's like, on the one hand, it sounds like Jesus is being merciful to the demons. He's being merciful to them because he's like, okay, I'll let you end it on your terms. Instead of like Jesus is being like, nope, my way or the highway. So on the one hand, Jesus seems kind of merciful. On the other hand, considering to what lengths the demons would do to get away from him, makes you like question, like, dude, I really don't want to see this guy when he's not merciful. And so, just some funny food for thought. I always thought that was kind of funny. I guess I have a dark sense of humor that way. But basically, after the demons are driven out, the town freaks out. And it makes sense because, you know, the text tells us that these pigs belong to like a pig farm. And this is where you get that whole thing where like the land of the Gerasenes would have been like very Roman. and not Jewish. This is not like Jewish territory. So Jesus is like hanging out in a very Roman area. Because remember, the Israelites would not have eaten pigs. They would have viewed pigs as like unclean animals. But it wouldn't be a problem for like, any of the other groups that were around. So there's that as well. But of course, there's another thing that's interesting that like a lot of preachers bring this up. I might as well bring it up as well, and it comes back to that point about how people they as a society we tend, and I use that we loosely. Like I don't speak for all of humanity through history, obviously, but we as people generally we tend to put spirituality and spiritual matters as like the least important things. And so what's interesting is Jesus heals a guy that's like been a problem in this town for a while apparently. But the people aren't grateful. And the reason why they're not grateful is because Jesus ends up by allowing Legion to possess a bunch of pigs and commit suicide. Then the town saw this as like, oh, this is bad because it actually totally messed up our economic standing. Because 2,000 pigs is a lot of pigs, which means that's a lot of money, which means they're now 2,000 pigs down on their economy, which is not good because you need that for a bunch of things. Because pigs, or I mean, primarily being food, that's 2,000 pigs worth of bacon, which is a lot. That's a lot of money that's just down the drain, quite literally, apparently. So, not good for the people. And what's interesting is that the people cared more about the economic loss than they do about a person's spiritual well-being. Now, of course, there's the whole like utilitarian way of looking at it. The livelihoods of this town through 2,000 pigs is more important than like the health of one guy. That would be the utilitarian way of analyzing the scene. And they'd be like, if you take it solely utilitarian, then you'd be like, yeah, Jesus did leave these guys worse off by like screwing their economy. But this also shows like what Jesus actually cares about as well. And of course, you probably hear the Christian rhetoric of how Jesus cares more about our spiritual lives than he does our physical lives, which is mostly true, but I think there's that can easily be misinterpreted, which is where you get stuff like Gnosticism from. Because Gnostics would take that philosophy of Jesus cares more about the spiritual part of our lives than our physical, and then take that to the extreme by saying spiritual good, physical bad. But I disagree with that part. I disagree that just because let me word it this way. Just because Jesus deeply cares about our spiritual lives, which we as people naturally neglect and even suppress, that doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't care about our physical well-being. Obviously he does. But the reason why the spiritual aspect is often emphasized when Christians talk about like what Jesus cares about is because we as people naturally neglect the spiritual. And so you kind of have to bring up that like, okay, like Jesus' care for your spiritual life is very important. Because if he doesn't do it, you ain't gonna do it. So I think that's kind of the logic behind it. But a lot of people like I think people get caught up in the details, and that's where you get like Gnosticism and stuff like that, and wrong think like that. So just some thoughts about that story. Finally, we have the last part of it to talk about where after the demon is driven out, the people tell Jesus to go away because they're like, we don't you've caused enough trouble for us, leave us alone. The former demoniac wants to be a disciple and hang around with Jesus. And it was interesting that Jesus goes, no, um, that won't be necessary. What Jesus does is interesting. He just tells them like, oh yeah, go back to your home and tell people what the Lord has done for you. Yeah, that's the way he says it. He says it. Go back to your hometown and tell them what the Lord has done for you. So you can add that to the counter of how many times Jesus says he's God without saying he's God. He gives instructions to this guy to be like, go and tell people what the Lord has done for you. And so Jesus assumes that authority again. And the other thing that's interesting about this commission that Jesus tells this guy is that, you know, the guy didn't need to go through like tons of like Bible school training or anything. All Jesus instructs this guy to do is tell them your testimony, tell them how God uh, has saved you and changed your life. And there's a lot of power in that. And the book of Revelation does mention that, we show the power of the church, if you will, by the blood of the lamb and the word of our testimony. And the human testimony is very powerful. And I think that's something that I know in the modern era, especially in our high knowledge society, I think we tend to downplay that because, of course, like, you know, to be fair, we should be skeptical on just testimony alone. Uh, testimony needs to be backed up by, first, obviously, facts, and secondly, when it comes to the spiritual matters, that's all the more reason why we have to be very studious of the word, because people can give testimonies that end up not being good testimony because it's wrong, and also because it may not necessarily line up with the word. And so that's something very important to consider. But that I know there's that tough um, push and pull of how we value the power of testimony. And to be fair, I'm guilty of being a person who's like, okay, like, downplay testimony, because first of all, you compare me with like with other Christians that have like way cooler quote unquote testimony stories than I do. Like, I have like the most nerd ass version of like the Christian testimony, where it's like, more or less, I studied the Bible, I studied history, and I was convinced that the Bible is true, and that's how I came to believe. Like that, like, that's my testimony in a nutshell. There's nothing in like compared to other like testimony stories about, like, for example, a good buddy of mine. I mentioned him a number of times on this channel. He was like, he was born into like a really crappy part of um, Ethiopia, and he was a child soldier, and so there's a lot of messed up baggage that comes with that. He comes to like America, and he gets stooped into like the gang life, and so he was a gangster, and of course along with that he was like super addicted to like drugs, and that basically like messed up his life so bad. uh, he lost his like he had like a wife and daughter, but then of course being in a gang and the drugs obviously drove them away, and then he ended up moving to Vancouver and still doing drugs, and you know shooting a few people up. uh, he eventually like found himself at like on the streets, and uh, eventually he went to like the Christian organization that helps with alcohol and drug addiction, and that's where he got saved. So you compare my story about a nerd who just reads the Bible and a lot of history versus former gangster. Like my story looks so uncool, and so uh, and it's easy to, and I know a lot of Christians. And a message to any of you that are in the same boat as me, don't ever feel like, oh, like, man, my testimony story sucks compared to some other ones. But hey, like, in the end, it's about how Jesus has forgiven our sins through his death. And that's why, once again, see, my uh being a shoot 'em up gangster ain't cool. Well, you're right, it isn't. And that's why, to the point I'm going to now, it's those things, it's not those things that are important, especially when it comes to the Christian walk. It's about what Jesus Christ has done for us through his death and resurrection, forgiveness of sins, be accepted by the Father through Jesus' actions. It is those things that matter. And how you get there, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't really matter. That's my belief. How you get there ultimately doesn't really matter. I mean, yes, it's true. Your path, you are a continuation of your path, but what's more important is, are you living a life forgiven today? That will always be more important, and that's why I emphasize it the way I do, because once again, like, and this is where, like, you think of like the internet era and why cancel culture is, I believe it's a very evil philosophy. I believe cancel culture is a very evil philosophy. Well, primarily because it's the antithesis of Christianity. Because Christianity believes in that, well, it is, do you believe in Jesus today is what matters. Who you were in the past, like, it's okay, you can't say that it completely doesn't matter. That's not true. But you are not defined by your past. You are defined by who you are today. And the Christian question would be, ultimately, are you a person who is following Jesus today? That's kind of what's important. Who you are in the past does play a role, but it doesn't define who you are. And so, to get to to come back to your comment, Tom, I think that's something that a lot of people, they think too much about. Sorry about the running water sound, but I think people think way too much about that, as opposed to thinking about what is important. And my conviction is that it's, are you living a life forgiven of sin and growing in wanting to know God and to know Jesus Christ? That's what's important. And so, things like, so what if you had like the wild ass backstory before you came to faith? Like, yeah, it does have strength to it to show that God can change anyone, which is why, like, okay, that is partly why the wild backstories are, they're kind of cool in that sense, that, like, God can change anyone. But it's about who Jesus is, not about how effed up you were before, if that makes sense. It's more about how good Jesus is. And so, with that said, that's what Jesus is telling the demoniac in the story. Go and tell people what has happened today. Go tell them about who you are now, what the Lord has done. Tell them about that. You don't have to tell people about how effed up you were before. Because what's interesting about in the Mark story is that Mark goes in these few details about how, like, okay, the guy, he would, like, hang around in crypts, and God knows what he was doing there. He would be a nuisance to the town, wailing at night and cutting himself with stones. The guy was pretty messed up. But when Jesus tells this guy, go tell the people you know about what the Lord has done, the focus is the healing he is receiving day by day, not being figuratively and literally chained to his past. And I think that's the important thing that uh, Jesus is instructing this guy to do, is to tell people about the power of God today, not being chained to the past. And so that's what uh, that's I think that's a takeaway from the story that a lot of people tend to forget about. Like, it's supposed to be obvious, but I know a lot of people can get caught up in like details. I think that you can kind of get distracted as opposed to just being confident in knowing what Jesus is doing for you today. All right, so well, we're already like an hour in, and we got to get a move on here. So, uh, we have the next story, and it's actually like two stories. Well, because the second story kind of happens in the middle of the story. So now Jesus encounters the leader of a synagogue. So what's interesting here is that in the earlier chapters of Mark, it's pretty well established that there's some kind of tumultuous relationship between Jesus and the religious authorities. And the main notion most people would get is that, like, well, Jesus acting on his authority as opposed to like the system. It grinds gears of, it grinds the system's gears, figuratively and literally, I guess. And so the religious authorities would have trouble, like, they wouldn't like Jesus because he's cramping up their style. So when we get to verse 21, and it begins the story with someone from that group, the religious authorities, comes to Jesus for help. That would be, it's important to it's important to think of it as like one of those things of like ancient world psychology and philosophy. It's, I mean, not like it still doesn't exist today. It exists in a lot of places that is not North America. And it's this idea of like shame, the shame and honor culture. So, the easy uh, poke, if you will, that I tend to do. Maybe I should find another country to be my punching bag about this. But like Japan is like very shame and honor culture. Well, let's be real. The reason why they make a good punching bag is because it's so obvious in Japanese culture. Like, you'd have to be an idiot not to notice. But in Japanese culture, there's very high amount of shame and honor culture. And so I remember I had to dispel more myths when I was talking with a person about like going to Japan and stuff like that. Because this person I know, they want to go there, and they were talking about like, I've heard so many good things about how like uh, polite the people are and how like clean the country is, which is those things are true, but a lot of that comes from the shame and honor culture. And you think about like, it's funny because like in a way, people view Christianity in the same way, which I think is why a lot of people like Christianity has been growing in Japan quite a bit, because there is this kind of compatibility. Not the best way of looking at it, but I mean, if people are following Jesus, regardless of their motivation, that's good enough, I guess. But a big part of why a lot of Japanese people convert to Christianity, and why like Christianity has a strong foothold even within like Japanese media, is because there's strong connections to ideas of shame and honor. And of course, like, Christianity does play into shame and honor culture because it's, it started out as a Jewish religion. So, and Israel was a pretty shame and honor culture. That was the whole thing with like one of the issues of the Old Testament that a lot of people tend to forget. When you read through like the Old Testament laws, and some people think, well, some ideas are backwards, quote unquote. in the Old Testament? Well, it's because of the way that in North America we've changed our attitudes towards shame and cult as shame and honor in our culture. But in in first century Israel, yeah, shame and culture, huge deal. And so one aspect we kind of see it here is like a religious leader asking the guy causing your camp trouble for help. That would have been viewed as very shameful. And so that's why a lot of like pastors would point out that like it took a lot of balls for Jairus to ask Jesus for help because he was effectively doing something extremely shameful in his culture. It's the equivalent of asking your enemy for help. And you know, you watch a lot of animes like Jujutsu Kaisen and whatnot. One of the big, like, you have that like very dramatic moment where like, oh, normally we're enemies, but now we gotta like work together in this like against this common evil kind of thing. And there's like a lot of tension because the characters deal with the idea of like what I'm doing is very shameful, but at the same time, you know, like maybe I can like I should put my shame and honor aside because my life is kind of on the line or someone else's life is on the line. But at the same time, my that shame and honor culture is so ingrained into me. How can I not stop thinking about this? And so that's something, you know, that's it's basically that dynamic, but less anime, I guess, here, where Jairus asks Jesus for help, and it's a pretty big request. You know, he wants Jesus to heal his daughter. So another thing that would have made that ballsy, and this is where like, okay, yeah, I've heard it so many times, but like, you know, in the Bible, this like patriarchy and women treated as second class citizens. I mean, it's like, okay, guys, like, grow up. It's not like the Bible says this is a problem. It's not just a Bible problem. It's an everywhere problem that in ancient world, and it's one of those things where it's like, thank God we don't live in the ancient world. Okay, like we should be grateful we live in the 21st century because the 21st century, despite its problems, is a pretty great place to live in. But in the ancient world, this guy's daughter would have been viewed as like second class. Why bother? Why would you throw your honor and shame for the life of a second class citizen? That's effectively what's happening. Which to us as modern readers would be like, seriously, what is wrong with like why that like what is wrong with you to think like that? But in the ancient world that's how they thought. And of course it's not right. Which is one reason why Jesus agrees to help him. Because Jesus clearly doesn't care about that shame and honor culture. He's like, screw it. If this person needs my help, I'm going to help them. And with that being said, oh, so what if it's just some little girl who's not that important in society? Jesus is going to help her. And so there's immediately that huge break from the cultural norms in the story. And just to remind the audience how subversive, I guess you could say, Jesus was, and by extension, how the Christian life is subversive, if you will. I don't like using that word subversive because I know a lot of people like in the political world nowadays it refers to like socialism, like socialists being subversive, but not to equate Christianity and socialism, but being subversive is something they both do. Because once again, I mean, to be subversive just means you go against the status quo. And so, I mean, that's Christianity's whole shtick, is that it's always going against the status quo. At least it's, um, quote unquote, most effective. I hate saying it that way. But Christianity is most effective when it is going against the grain of the culture, which was actually why a lot of people thought that a lot of historians and scholars of medieval scholars, uh, that's why it's tend to be viewed down upon when like there was a quote unquote Christian empire, because you end up running into the, I mean, it's kind of funny we're running into the problem again today, but not in the Christian sense. Uh, Once Christianity had, it didn't have to fight that subversive battle anymore. Christianity ended up becoming a problem in their society, because if it no longer had to uh, focus on its subversive aspects like caring for the poor and uh, putting your allegiance to Christ before state, when Christianity stopped being that, then it stopped being effective, which was one of the major reasons why the Christian empire of the medieval ages ended up collapsing, and why it was not good overall, was because of that. Is because by nature, uh, Christianity is meant to be quote unquote subversive. Uh, in the world today, the reason why, contrary to what people might tell you, well, that's because it's, once again, it's scope of perspective. So this is what I meant earlier when like, okay, we see it playing out again. The whole like, when you stop having battles to fight, you end up creating your own battles, and then you become the problem, which is where a lot of liberalism has fallen into today. Back in the day, liberalism was a good thing because it was fighting certain aspects of the status quo that was not good. That was taking away people's freedoms. It was preventing people from living a better life. And so liberalism fought against the status quo then. And even if you don't agree with all their ideas, which, I mean, I don't, but I would still stand behind the cause, because there were legitimate battles to be fought. But then once those battles, we don't fight those battles in the 21st century. So when a lot of people in those camps still try and fight the same battle, even though the battle had already been won, it ended up just making fights for no good reason. And then that's why people are like, oh God, right? We don't want to deal. And that's why there's a shift nowadays. You know, in the YouTube world, we call it like red pilling and stuff. That's why red pilling exists. Red pilling basically exists because this sounds terrible, but like basically as a society we've OD'd on the blue pill, because in reality you need both, and you need to balance both. You balance both. You don't just take one continuously and then like OD on it, which is the problem we keep running into. Because people don't know when to like find balance. But anyway, uh, this is the problem that North America has run into, and that's why red pilling basically exists. But in other places in the world, Christianity is growing because, once again, Christianity is doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's fighting against tyrannical um, ideas, I guess, and caring about the people. That's why you hear stories about like how there's a huge growth in like China. Like Christianity in China is like massively growing, because I mean when you're living under like, you know, the Chinese communist state and how horrible it is, how dehumanizing it is, then an idea that's about love your neighbor, care for one another. Yeah, that sounds wonderful. That's something we should be doing. And so uh, that's why Christianity grows in a lot of other countries outside of North America. See, in North America, we tend to believe that like, well, I think what's happening in North America is that we've because we've dealt with Christianity for so long, we think that like, oh, we can do better. But then we end up saying like, okay, we're gonna do it our own way, but our own way is what led to the problem in the first place. You know, you think of like going back to like communist China, it comes down to like a dictator doing things his way, and everyone has to fall in line to it. Doing things our way. Whereas the way that God wants us to live is like, no, love one another, be good to each other. And there's that whole discourse I had in the book of Exodus readings, which you should definitely check out the playlist. One of the major themes of Exodus, and the biggest misunderstanding people have of like the Old Testament law, is that the reason why the laws were strict, if you will, was because God was effectively saying, look, you guys know what living a shitty life was like when you guys were slaves for 400 years in Egypt. Now that I have delivered you out of slavery, I expect you to be good to each other. And so here are a bunch of rules that may be strict, but this is the best way, at least at the time, to ensure that that objective is achieved, that you are good to each other. And I know that's one of those things that like that's the reason why it's a tough pill to swallow. Is I mean the way I worded it kind of gives it away. Is God effectively saying, I expect you to be good. This is not a suggestion. I'm not saying, well, you should be good to each other. God, that's not what God is saying. He's saying, I expect you. I expect you to be good. The same way that like a parent expects their kids to do well in school. Or even beyond that, it's like, I expect you to like treat, try and make a good life for yourself. And that's by not doing drugs, by uh, not having sex before marriage, kind of thing. Like when parents kind of tell their kids, we have these expectations for you. Of course, the things that see the problem is what most parents don't communicate well is that the parents, and it goes back to the honor shame. Well, okay, part of it is the honor and shame thing. So let me try and paint it this way. So let's say so you have parents and they're raising a kid, and they tell the kid like, I expect you to like not I expect you to live a good life by not doing drugs and to not have uh, sex early in life and whatever. I expect you, uh, and I would be greatly disappointed if you did those things. What parents are terrible at communicating is, especially when some parents come from experience. But one of the troubling things is that it doesn't rely the experience. Like, let me put it this way: not all parents should have to have experience, if that makes sense. So, using a using an older example I used earlier, okay, like myself versus my buddy Jamal. And so, if Jamal were to tell his kids, Adam, oh, that's the name of Jamal's son, by the way. Adam, I expect you to do well in your life, and one of those expectations includes do not do drugs. Now, Jamal probably could be very forthcoming with his son and say, like, look, son, I totally messed up my life once because I was into drugs. And that's a pretty easy way of scaring straight your kid. Be like, yeah, my life was messed up. The reason why I'm an old man before you were born was because I had to start later in life because I messed it up so badly by doing drugs when I was younger. Okay, that could work, but that's not something I could be like, Minerva, I expect you not to do drugs. But I can't tell her that like because I used to do it because that's not true. I can't be like, Minerva, I expect you not to do drugs because I did like because like I don't have that experience. But at the same time, I think it's kind of ridiculous to expect all parents to be able to speak from experience in that sense. What, does everybody have to be so messed up just to make sure stuff isn't messed up later? Like that's a weird way of thinking of things, and that's not realistic either. Um, but one of those things is when it comes to like uh, shame and honor, and when it comes to like those expectations, I think it's something that a lot of people uh, I'm losing. I've lost my. I've gone on so far a tangent that like, oh no, how do I bring this back to the Gyrus story and like talk about shame and honor? But when it comes to like raising kids and using like, you shouldn't have to rely on shame and honor uh, to get points across to your children. which one of those things, and to be fair, that was one of the failings, if you will, not on God's part though. See, I have to be careful. The caveat is that the failing is not on God's part of trying to explain to like the Israelites, okay, here are these expectations, and I expect you to follow them. Because when God in the Old Testament is about like, okay, I expect you not to do these things because they're bad, and God obviously doesn't speak from experience, not his own experience. But what he does, which I know is not the most convincing thing to a modern audience, but Jesus points out, or sorry, God in the Old Testament points out that you see these other nations around you, they've been doing this. And then, of course, there's the whole discourse about how, quote unquote, the holy war, if you will, that takes place in the book of Joshua. God explains to the Israelites that, like, I gave these people. Okay, so when you go and dispossess the land from these people that are living there now, there's a point in Deuteronomy that's made that God says, I'm not doing it because you guys are good. Far from it. You guys are stiff-necked, stubborn little SOBs. I'm allowing you to dispossess these people because of how awful they were. Like, you thought you were bad. Like, this is a God is effectively saying, you guys are pretty terrible, but these guys over here are way worse. And the reason why I gave you those laws earlier was so you don't emulate these people. Because if you emulate their crappy, awful, shitty behavior, I'm gonna do the same thing to you, which is exactly what happened. But basically, it was that shame and honor thing does come into play, and I know most Bible scholars would use this explanation, which, understandably, if people are like, okay, it's not the best explanation, and I mean, you kind of can't really come up with a better one, at least not logically. But basically, the reason why God is willing to play along with the idea of shame and honor when he made the commandments and the laws in Leviticus and whatnot. Now we're coming back to okay. Now I'm coming back to what I was really talking about, like this shame honor thing. So the reason why God he plays along with it because it is how humans understand morality. That is how humans understand morality. And so, if humans are all about shame and honor, and once again, this is a thing that has been in the human zeitgeist since forever, since probably the earliest days of human evolution, is the idea of shame and honor. And so, God plays along with it because it's what humans would understand. And so, with that said, this is the mindset that very I shouldn't say alien. It shouldn't be alien to a modern reader, especially in North America. I think one of the things that I guess my critique now would be when you hear a modern person, postmodernism, talk about how like the Bible's backwards in this kind of thinking. It's not because of God's discourse on how to deal with it, but rather human beings incorporate shame and honor into everything, including the Word of God. And that's because that is a very natural human thing to do. Humans always live by shame and honor. It is probably one of the most basic aspects of human psychology that exists, is shame and honor. And I mean, if you want a simple, I mean, I already went to the deep end. Let's come back to the mild end of the pool, if you will. That's like why kids make a big deal about like why bullying is a thing with kids. It's about shame and honor. Why it's important for kids not to humiliate each other is because shame and honor is so important. That's why you when you deal with a kid, you don't embarrass a child, because shame and honor is a very huge aspect. I mean, that's one of those things, I gotta tell the story now. So one of the things that's I always have to arm wrestle with on Discord. And I remember I was taken aback because of how low IQ this was. But I remember there were there was a bunch of kids and they were making jokes about like like a story, and someone used the term Netflix and chill, and someone used it unironically, and then everyone else was kind of like kind of thing, right? And half of them were like, the reaction, and the other half were kind of like treating it like normal, because there were a lot of people in this community that didn't know what that meant. And I remember I chimed in a little bit, kind of like, wait, why, like, how do you people not know what Netflix and chill is referring to? That phrase and that euphemism has been a thing for like a decade. Oh my god, I'm old. But like, that thing has been like, the phrase Netflix and chill has been a thing for like a decade. Hell, Netflix itself has been a thing for like almost 3 decades. I'm pretty sure the phrase Netflix and chill referring to sex is like, it could be older than 10 years. In the internet zeitgeist, it's like over a decade now. Just over a decade, I think. The phrase Netflix and chill. And then I was pointing out that I'm like, how do you people not know this? Like, what? Are you living underneath like patches of dirt underneath a boulder or something? Like, how do you not know this? And then somebody mentioned like, hey man, there are minors here. And I was just like, this is Discord. In order to sign up for anything on the internet, you have to be over 13. If you haven't had the sex talk by the time you're 13, your parents have failed you miserably. Or some teacher, some guardian figure in your life has failed you miserably. How have you not had the sex talk by the time before you were 13? Let alone like some of these guys might have been like 16 or 17. Which only makes it worse that if you haven't had the sex talk by the time you're 17, oh god, right? Like that's a mind-boggling thing to me. I mean, I had to deal with that from my parents when I was like 10, maybe younger. It's a little like, see, that's why like I thought the thing was so low IQ, and I like, what, like, first of all, I wasn't being vulgar about it when I mentioned the whole like Netflix and chill referring to like sex. That's like, I'm just defining words and saying that like this is a euphemism and it refers specifically to this thing. That's all I'm saying. I never had the talk. I had the internet in my room. See, but I mean that. Okay, so with that said, see, this is why the other half of it is so low IQ. You think with the internet, once again, you couldn't be. It goes back to my original question. What, you live underneath patches of dirt underneath a boulder? If you're like, you have the internet, you're over 13, and you don't know what the phrase Netflix and chill is referring to. Like that was absurd. Like that idea was absurd to me. But I think one of the issues was that like, okay, anyway, sorry. Let me backtrack it. So the reason why I found that so low IQ is because I believe in bodily autonomy. And not in the way that certain political groups talk about bodily autonomy. I'm talking about what bodily autonomy actually refers to, which a lot of people don't know, so I'm going to define it for you. Bodily autonomy is the idea that if you enter a public space, you are meant to be treated as a peer. Because the reason why it's called bodily autonomy is because you as a person, as a free agent, can make voluntary decisions, even relatively early in life, like 13. That's why, like, okay, the internet thinks it's 13. So I'm going to use 13 as the reference number or the reference age. So if you enter a public space, you do that assumed to be on your own volition. You are an individual free-thinking agent. And a big caveat is that there's a responsibility to being a free-thinking agent. If you're a 13-year-old and you enter a public space, I will assume to talk to you like you are an adult. So, an easy way to evaluate bodily autonomy in this way is, let's say you and I are having a debate. And okay, I don't know how old you are, Tom. I assume you're quite a bit younger than me, though. Uh, it is a weird question to ask, Tom. Uh, are you underage? I'll start with that. You're 38. Oh, you're older than me. uh, you're older than me, so you're not a good example to use. But let's say, okay, I'll use you as the example. So, uh, you're a 38-year-old and you enter a public space. Uh, hey, Gauntlets, welcome to the stream. I also know Gauntlet's age, so I know he's not underage, so we can't use him for the analogy either. Everything's going pretty well so far. Anyway, we can't use Gauntlets either because he's also not underage. Uh, and I can't reference anyone in my own channel because I try to avoid having like underage people because like power dynamic. I don't want to. Well, this is the reason why I tend not to have like underage people in the voice chat with me. Let's say we're having let's say you're having a debate with somebody. Uh, Tom, you being 38. Let's say you're having a debate with somebody, and you think they're wrong about their opinion. You cannot say to them, "Well, you're a dumb kid, so you don't know." That's not a valid argument. And that's a form, well, not only is it a form of character assassination, it also dejects from bodily autonomy because if you have even if they're like 16 or something, you're talking to a 16-year-old, because they've entered a public space, it's assumed that they should be treated like an adult. And the in Western culture, part of that means uh, you maintain the right to free speech. So you're allowed, like, discussion topics, everything is allowed to be on the table. So uh, with bodily autonomy, you cannot talk down to someone because of their age, because that would also be ageism. So when it comes to, I don't know why we even, I've kind of lost track of why we even talk about this particular thing. Oh yeah, when it comes to like how people interact with each other, and when God was making the laws in the Old Testament, he was saying that like, okay, uh, when I expect you to do certain things, uh, and why I'm dispossessing these other people was because of how awful they were. God doesn't speak from he doesn't speak from his own experience because, well, God isn't going around sacrificing babies, but God tells the Israelites, "Don't do this, or else I'm gonna make someone else kick you out of the land," which is exactly what happened. And so, I know a lot of people they look into like the Old Testament. I'm trying to go back to the earlier context. I know we went to that weird tangent with the bodily autonomy and the online discourse thing, but it kind of what I was getting at is um, it can be a little rough when you try to just speak from experience and you can't just use experience to trump any other argument because then you risk your experience being like an authoritative anecdote, which is a dangerous mindset. You can't treat your own experience as if it holds like a primal authority because it doesn't. It's your experience. Your experience is important, but that doesn't mean that you can just trump someone telling you like a logical argument based on your experiences alone, which is one of those ironic things where like Christians run into this problem all the time. And this is why, like, as I've mentioned so many times already today, let alone every other Bible stream I ever do, is the reason why we always have to check anything we think about and even our experiences, even our religious experiences. Um, we always have to check with scripture because you cannot turn your religious experience even into a form of authority. And that's something that I find a lot of Christians do, which is actually pretty dangerous because that's where you get Christians mistreating other Christians based on their experiences. That's that is a very dangerous rabbit hole to ever go through. And it's one of those things that like I think it's one of those things, especially like, okay, so now that you've told me how old you are, Tom, like you and I probably like have a good grasp of this. I know a lot of younger people, they still, well, they're still finding themselves. So it may not be as obvious to them. But as we get older, um, and we do have life experience, and of course that it is important, and that's why like when I hang out with a couple of guys on another YouTube channel, and they're all a lot younger, and I often speak from experience. But at the same time, I don't just say, well, my experience automatically makes it right. I use my experience to be like, okay, think of, I think we need to reconstruct the way we view ideas by what works and what doesn't work. And so that's the reason why experience can be helpful. Because, okay, like using myself as an example, uh, like not doing drugs. I've known people who've done lots of drugs. And so my life experience and the life experience that I learned from other people and glean from their life experience, I can be like, yeah, I can just make that rational decision that like doing drugs is a bad idea. But I think a lot of people like, well, part of it is because a lot of young people don't have experience, and part of the problem of the modern internet age is that uh, because, well, this is the whole thing with like my very first podcast, How to Knowledge. Yeah, I have a whole playlist of podcasts on the channel. Check them out if you have time. But we live in a time period where like knowledge is like all knowledge is basically accessible to us. Thank God for modern technology and the internet. But at the same time, life experience does have its place because we are not 0 hour people. Zero hour refers to like past completely irrelevant. So uh, you think of like your existence as just like things only for here and now, which is can be dangerous because that leads to hedonism basically, and then hedonism causes problems because hedonism has no heed of the future, and so you have to think about the future as well, and so there's that whole discourse to go through. But when it comes to, which I know, like with that said, I know that like a lot of people can have that arm wrestle with Christianity because I did just mention earlier that like, okay, Christianity is, it doesn't absolve you from the past. I think that's the big misinterpretation people have. When like as I mentioned before, your past isn't the most important thing in Christianity. Who you were before. Now that doesn't mean that you're absolved from your past. But at the same time, the idea of Christianity is that you can be forgiven of your past. And thus you're not chained to it. You can have a changed life. You can change who you are. It's the whole thing where like okay, so a good example is that like when teenagers use like slurs, and you know teenagers do that because they try to be like edgy and they think they're edgy and cool, even though they're really not, but that's besides the point. Teenagers throw around like slurs because they think they're being edgy and cool, and then you become an adult. It would be wrong to judge a person by being like, well, when you were a teenager you did this stupid thing. It's like that, like that's like you can't judge people like that. That would be the wrong way in which you would judge. Which is why can that's why that there's a whole discourse about like cancel culture being like an evil ideology. Because like that's so unfair. You can't do that to people. You can't what is this? So what just happened? Sorry. Try something here. Nope. Not that. Hang on. What is going on here? Oh. Okay, yeah, whatever. Something just went like weird and crap on my computer, so I just wanted to check what it was. Anyway, but it's one of those things of like, okay, I gotta try and wrap it back because we're already an hour and a half and I haven't even started chapter 6 yet. But uh, the reason why I talk about like the whole life experience thing is because it does play a lot into like how we. I mean, that's why it's shame and culture. Shame and honor culture is an important thing. And now I remember why the whole like don't embarrass a kid. That was where I started with this, and I'm trying to like reel my mind back. I mean, come on, you guys on the Streaming Parson channel, you guys know I go on like crazy tangents a lot of the time. But you don't embarrass a kid just because you have life experience. You have more life experience than some kid does. But instead of embarrassing them, you're supposed to mentor the new generation with your experience. You don't shame them. You don't embarrass children. And that's why like I think that was one of the big problems in our society is that we raised a generation, mainly my generation and Tom's because we're millennials. We were a generation raised on like we were often we were often shamed, and I think that's why the millennial generation really rebelled against like the older generation was because the older generation, uh, like my parents' generation, for instance, the way they went about shame and honor culture was just so awful. And when you put down your kid, or like especially like in public, I remember like I had a schoolmate when I was younger, and it was crazy. He was a really bad kid, and his mom straight up like spanked him in public. I remember this pretty clearly, and the reason is that like I swear that dude is so traumatized, even to this day probably. Because that can be a pretty traumatizing thing, and that's why like in a modern internet Discord we have like this huge talk about like traumas and overemphasizing it. Not like traumas weren't a problem in the past, but it's because the way that the millennial culture was raised poorly on the shame and honor culture. Uh, we were shamed a lot in our youth, and that built up. That's where we have the very like traumatized culture, if you will. Our generation is very traumatized because that happened to us, and that's why like when I talk about like how it's so important to like not uh, shame young people based on your experiences, but that was the big killer of the millennial generation. And I think that's one of the things about like especially moving forward now that we're older and we kind of get it. I think that's why it's so important to acknowledge the way shame and culture, shame and honor culture. Why do I keep saying shame and culture? Shame and honor culture behave. I think we really need to understand that a lot better, which we have lost that in our modern era. And I think part of it is because it's a reaction. I think the reason why a lot of younger people today they try to be like no shame whatsoever in what they do, no matter how ridiculous it is, uh, because they really want to try and break away from that culture. But at the same time, I don't think you can. I don't think you can actually completely remove shame and honor culture because it is something so ingrained in people. We are people built on shame and culture. Shame and see, I did it again. Shame and honor culture. Uh, we're just so it's so ingrained in us, and even as early as childhood. Some things should be shamed, and well, that's because I mean, yeah, you're right because well, there's several dimensions to it. One of them being that it's an evolutionary thing. Humans have done it for the sake of survival, and so bad habits should not be condoned because it's bad for your society. If it's bad for your society, it means you as a culture will not survive. So you're right about that. And but at the same time, there's also a balance that needs to be maintained, which to be fair is not easy, because you don't want to go to the opposite extreme, which is where I brought up the whole like, I'm sorry, Japan, that I use you guys as a punching bag. I'm sorry, Japan. But Japan runs into the opposite problem. They're so ingrained in the shame and honor culture that it's almost, even though Japan seems like a nice place, it's very totalitarian in their culture. That's also why suicide rates are super high in Japan. It's because of that totalitarian um, kind of lifestyle, which is caused a lot by their shame and honor culture. And they take it to an extreme. Like that's the unhealthy extreme of like doing shame and honor. In America, our problem is that we don't have shame and honor culture, which is why we do really stupid ass things and just say don't judge me for X ridiculous thing. So there's obviously extremes, and one of the things that the Bible's see, this is where the Bible, I hate to use the word struggles, but it struggles to uh, it struggles in the sense of how even with faith in God and knowing forgiveness through the blood of Jesus Christ, we are still forced to deal with it. And even when Jesus himself may try and bypass shame and honor culture, it is so ingrained in human beings that it will always be an issue. And I think that's another thing too, that like another reason, if you will, of why. Okay, now I'm okay. It's coming back to me now. That's another reason why Christianity was always like a tough religion to accept as it like went to different places. Like why Christianity had so much struggle in Japan. I swear I gotta do that podcast one day. Uh, my own take on the Christianity Japan dynamic. Not that people haven't already made like tons of videos on that and tons of books have been written on that, but basically, Christianity has to arm wrestle with like, okay, Jesus wants us to surpass shame and honor culture, but shame and honor culture is just so ingrained in human beings that it's you cannot untrain that out of a person, because even because no matter how hard you try, it is something that we humans just naturally do. It's the whole like, okay, in like North American problem example is like, okay, you shouldn't judge people for uh like certain life decisions. This is where I don't know why YouTube keeps feeding me this garbage, but like the whatever podcast keeps showing up on my YouTube. Is it because I also do podcasts, so I have to like see stuff like the whatever podcast? And basically, the TLDR of whatever podcast is this dude named Brian, and he gets like these girls onto his show and they talk ideas. But the girls he finds, most of them are like pretty awful. They're like usually like OnlyFans girls, or they work in like um, either this. See, he always gets like the worst people, and the reason why the whatever podcast is such garbage is because um, okay, whatever podcast pays tons of money for YouTube to push on everyone. You know, that's probably why you have to deal with that. But the reason why it's such garbage um, is because Brian, I don't want to make it sound like he's being overly malicious, but there is some malice in it, where he takes like the worst, quote unquote, the worst kind of women, and then because they're so awful and their takes are so stupid, it's easy for him to like peg them down, if that makes sense. And that's just another form of bullying. Even if you don't agree with their lifestyle, even if like, once again, I clearly um, don't think the OnlyFans lifestyle is good. Okay, it's clearly bad, but there's a difference between like just pegging people down, and that's where like once again like the shame and honor thing comes in, and this is where like in the West, Brian tries to play a little bit of the shame and honor game, and then he uses it to humiliate these women because they don't view the shame and honor culture the way he does. And that's what it comes down to. That's basically what the whatever podcast is in a nutshell. Is this shame and honor idea, and the pegging down of people with he's basically pegging down people who don't have a strong sense of shame and honor. So as you were saying, Tom, something should be shamed, and yes, that's true. But at the same time, the tough part is how we go about it, right? Because you don't want to turn it into a form of bullying, which is how many societies do it. And using the Japan culture example, it's almost a type of bullying. It's essentially like governmental bullying, uh, with shame and the way that shame and honor is practiced there. But anyway, going back to the whatever podcast as the example, uh, that's something he does a lot, and I don't like it. I don't like that he uses that as like a bludgeon on these women. And even though like there are things they say and do which is just like, yeah, you should be shamed for that. Like I remember this one clip I did love though, and it was Michael Knowles was on the show. Michael Knowles is a pretty good guy, part of the Daily Wire. I know a lot of people immediately think like red flags because Daily Wire is like super right wing, but Michael Knowles is like he's kind of the exception. Out of all of them, he's the one of them that is like actually I like. And there was a part where uh, Knowles was they were talking about like because this always comes up on the whatever podcast is once again like Brian usually this is where like you gotta be mad skeptical about this, right? Because how come so many of his guests are like work in the porn industry? Like seriously, think about that for a minute. But um, there's a part where like Brian was talking to one of the OnlyFan girls on his podcast, and he was talking about like we need to shame the quote unquote hoe phase that women go through. That was kind of his thesis, and someone was pointing out that like, well, what if it's not a phase? What if it's a lifestyle, which is not a good defense? It's part of the whole like Brian picking on. This is where like the bullying kind of comes in, because like obviously the women Brian talks to always use like really terrible straw man arguments, and that's why it's so easy for Brian to like pick him, knock him down a peg. But the woman was like, "What if it's not like a phase, but it's like a lifestyle?" And then Brian was like, "Well, okay, what would you like? You call it like a lifestyle, so like obviously you have like a high body count." So he was going on like pretty aggressive attack, and the girl dodged the question because she didn't want to. Like I think there's something intuitive in her that she didn't want to shame herself by listing her high body her high body count. Because obviously, if you're not willing to answer a question like that, it's obviously an unacceptable answer. But uh, the girl like she deflects it by saying like, well, she knew a person that had like a number of like 300, which is one of those things that's like, no way, that's straight up made up. How the hell do you have sex with 300 people? Assuming you started having sex with people at the age of 16 and you're in like your 30s. Okay, like okay, let's say like okay, this is how crazy a number of like 300 sexual partners is. So I'm 36. Uh, let's assume I started having sex at the age of 16. So the reason I picked this is because it makes the math easier. We have 20 years to work with. So 20 years, let's put that into weeks. So 20 years times 52 is 1,040. Yes, 1,040 weeks. In order to have 300 sexual partners, that means I had a new sexual partner every 3 weeks. And remember, I'm an old man, so you hear these girls, they talk about like they have like a body count of 300, and these women don't look older than like their mid 20s or late 20s. Let's say late 20s, right? I got a whole ass decade on some of these girls on uh, Brian's whatever podcast. I got a whole decade on them, which gives me like 10 years is that 500 weeks, which is a lot of time if you put that in perspective. That's why I'm an old man. 500 weeks is a long time. If I have that many weeks on you, yeah, I guess that's why people call me old. But like in perspective, to have 300 different sexual partners, I'm like, if I were to somehow pull that off, that means I had like a new sexual partner like every 3 weeks, which is a lot. And I mean, how are you not dead at that point? Because you're probably like, you probably would have killed yourself somewhere along that way by picking up all kinds of like STIs and whatever. And not to mention, uh, it's one of those things that just like makes like, well, the other thing too is that like the reason why guys can't have high body counts. Uh, sorry if I'm grossing you out, if I'm giving you the sex talk, but like there's a whole thing where like, uh, if a man's junk enters, the woman's compactor, every compactor is different, and so it it compacts the junk. Every compactor compacts it differently, which means the junk is gonna get like crushed in so many different ways to the point that like how is it not obliterated? See, when in a monogamous relationship, basically you acclimate, and that's why like once again this is like science explaining why monogamy is a good idea. But basically your junk uh, acclimates if you have just one sexual partner, and so uh, that means it doesn't get like destroyed. It doesn't shrink too much if you have one partner, if hardly at all after you've acclimated long enough. But like, if you had like 300 different sexual partners, like yeah, it would like destroy you. I mean, once again, like any number above 10 is considered like pretty disgusting. How that? And then okay, sorry, back to the whatever podcast. The whole joke was that Michael Knowles, because he was a guest on the show, he was shocked. He was shocked when he heard the number 300. He was shocked, and he was like, "What the hell, 300?" Like, and then the girls asked like Michael was like, "Okay, what's the highest you heard?" And then Mike was like, I once heard a person who said 100, and I thought that was crazy." And then I remember like I saw a guy's YouTube comment. It was so funny. He was like, "You know what the scariest part of that whole video was? Was the was the part that the women were looking at Michael Knowles like he was the crazy person in that scene, because like when Knowles was pointing out that like he thought 100 was crazy, but then these women are looking at him like he's the one who's crazy for like thinking 100 is a high number, when all these other women were like, oh no, like 300 is pretty normal number. It's like, what do you mean 300 is a normal number? That's just like that's like swarms of like STIs flying around, even if you use protection, because remember it's not a 100% guarantee. um and definitely like once again, when you break 100, obviously if it's not 99.99999 100% basically, yeah, you're gonna break the improbable part. And you thought Fire Emblem hit rates were bad, but yeah, when you're hitting number like 300, that's just like bad shit crazy. And so uh the way that like the point I wanted to get to was that the way that these people were so shameless about it. And that's why like once again, like understandable that like the dating market's down the crapper, because if you think about it, like dating and marriage is a high shame and honor kind of uh discourse. And once again, the reason, I mean, it makes sense because in a way everything should be like, human beings in a nutshell are very highly focused on shame and honor, because it's the easiest litmus of judging anything. And I think that's something that like, yeah, here's a funny hashtag terrible pastor moment, but I think more atheists need to use that as a better argument of where morality comes from, as opposed to being like, well, I can just decide that. It's like, no, there obviously is something going on. And I think people should just appeal to shame and honor culture a lot more when they're talking about like morality, because in a way, like shame and honor culture is an extremely important part of that. It's why you find like similarities between cultures, because shame and honor, the concept of shame and honor is something that's just almost biological in humans. Anyway, that was like an hour-long discourse on shame and honor. I guess we'll have to do an, maybe I'll like cut this piece of the whole video and just make a pre-recorded podcast and call it the Shame and Honor podcast. But then I have to do like the podcast format all over again, and then do it again. But I don't mind talking about it again. Maybe I'll have a co-host. Maybe I'll have a guest next time or something if I come back to the Shame and Honor discourse. But anyway, back with Jairus here and his idea of shame and honor. uh, it was a huge cost, and now I have to come back to one of the important things that the Bible tries to get at is to try and look past shame and honor, to show compassion. And that's kind of one of the things Jesus is doing here, is that there's a huge shame and honor element that's played out in the other people, but Jesus tries to bypass it. So first it starts with Jairus, and Jairus asks Jesus to heal his daughter. So Jesus is like, yeah, you know, I'll do it, even though we're technically like, even though we're technically enemies. Jesus puts shame and honor aside to show compassion, and that's something that Christians are supposed to do. Now, we don't do it perfectly, of course not. Nobody does, because once again, Jesus, being God, has the ability to bypass shame and honor. We as humans are too caught up in shame and honor. I mean, this video, this stream proves it. I just talked about it for like an hour straight. So, case in point, shame and honor is so ingrained into us. And so, this is played up a second time in the same story. And I think that's why when Mark was putting this together, he had no problem incorporating the story of the woman in the middle of the Jairus story, because they both hit on the same kind of idea. So you have this woman here, and she's like suffering from some kind of bleeding, some kind of hemorrhage, woman problems. Yeah, we'll just call it that. And she had been suffering for years. The Bible tells us she's been suffering for like what, 10, 12 years was it? Let me just quickly read it again. This woman had been suffering for this thing from like 12 years. And so she comes to the belief that like, okay, there's this Jesus guy. We've heard about his healings. If I touch his cloak, then I'll be healed. So she kind of approaches and she touches like this cloak, and then Jesus goes, "Hey, who touched me?" And then I love okay, on a side note, there's a little bit of like humor in the story where it's like, I like what the disciples' response is like, "What kind of a stupid question is that, Jesus?" Like, you're in this huge crowd and people are pushing all against you. Like, who isn't touching you at this point? And then it's kind of funny how the disciples kind of like look at Jesus like he just asked the stupidest question. It is funny. And then Jesus goes, well, hold on, like I felt power come out of me. And then there's a shame and honor aspect of the story again, where the woman is hesitant to reveal herself, because what if she had to explain why she wanted healing? A woman doesn't want to tell anyone, you know, that she's been having this womanly problems, and especially for 12 years, you know. And you know, there's other implications. Time for the sex talk. So if she's having this internal hemorrhaging, it makes her not just like, okay, so obviously there's the Jewish law back in Exodus and Leviticus about like men were instructed not to have sex with their wives when they were like in their menstrual cycle. And most of that is like, from a logical perspective, it's just cleanliness, honestly. Like, you don't want a, let's be real, guys, we don't want our little friend down there to be touching blood like that. So I mean, you wouldn't want to touch most blood with your fingers, let alone with your little buddy. Okay, let's just be honest, just be real. Okay, that was a good reason God gave that command in the Bible. Do not have sex with a woman when she's in a menstrual cycle, because it's not a good idea, because once again, they didn't have modern medicine, and thank God for modern medicine. Like, if we encounter that problem, we could get it treated. If you get like an infect, because it's like you can get infections from like uh, having blood come in contact with your junk. uh, you can get infections, and that's something that like, see, in modern day, it's not that big of a problem. We have, unless she like once again she passes you like an STD, like a serious one, you're gonna be fine. You can get it easily treated. It's not that big a deal today because thank God for modern medicine. But back then that didn't exist. So a good idea was just don't do it. I know you're horny, but just don't do it. Just save yourself the trouble. And so that's why they had that rule. So if you thought that was bad in Leviticus, imagine a woman who was just bleeding all the time down there. No man would touch her with a 10-foot pole. So this woman, it was very, very shameful for her to reveal that she had this condition for 12 years. Because there's several implications with that. One, that means she's probably still unmarried, probably into an older age. So let's assume. See, the not as bad route is that maybe we learned that, like, she learned that she had this condition when she was young and before she was married. And so let's say 16 she learned. I'm using that number loosely as a generous number, because once again, like, if a girl was going to be married at 18 but she found out before she could get married that she had this condition, and then she had to reveal to her family this was the problem, or reveal enough that she had to basically mark herself as not marriageable, which, once again, this is ancient world. So a woman who was not marriageable was already like looked down, like that was like, you're a failure in your society basically. And so this woman would have been viewed this way, which is, already a major oof. Like, she would have been looked down in society because she would have been unmarriageable for 12 years, which means, let's say we lowballed it at 16, and then we brought it, that 12 years later should be 28. So 28, she's still unmarried, which is basically old maid at that point, which is like, oof, bro. Like, that's like, a woman being unmarried at 28 in 2024 is not a big deal. First century Israel, though, completely different. First century anywhere, really. Completely different. There would have been a lot of shame. So imagine this woman's situation where if she had to come out and say that, like, yeah, I'm 28, haven't been married because I was unmarriageable, because I had a bleeding issue inside of me. Like, that would have been, that's not something a woman would want to tell, because first of all, if a guy learned that this woman was having the bleeding issue, he'd be like, I ain't touching that. So there was a lot of shame to be brought upon her with that. And so when you read this passage and you're like, well, why did the woman take so long to reveal herself? Was because I think she was thinking about that shame. And she would have been ashamed to admit that she had this problem. But eventually, there are two things that I think the story plays out. One, you can't hide forever. The truth comes out. So the woman's like, okay, we're gonna be stuck in this awkward position if nobody's if I don't speak the truth. So I'm gonna just get us out of this awkward situation and just say it. And then the second point that the story really cares about is, what's more important, shame and honor, or belief in God? And that's ultimately the contrast that every culture has with Christianity. Because that is the question that Christianity ultimately asks, is what is more important to you? Our inherent sense of shame and honor, or belief in God and His Word? And that is always going to be a tough tension. That's always going to be a tough thing to wrestle. Every single person will struggle with that, no matter where they are in their faith walk. It doesn't matter where you are in your life. You will always struggle with that. That will always be a struggle. And with that, the caveat with that is that that's why you can't really you can't shame people for having that mentality. It's ironic, right? So it's because it's that will always be a tough tension. But what Jesus promises us is that, you know, when you have belief in God, He will take care of you, and you don't have to be ashamed about what your needs are. And so, with that said, that's why, once again, like in a lot of places outside of like North America, Christianity is growing because of that. It's because the shame and honor that they've had to deal with in various societies where it can be soul crushing. Because you think of all like I haven't even gotten to this part of the shame and honor discourse, but like the societal pressures that it builds, going back with a little more punching Japan a little bit, but that's why like suicide rates are so high. Is because the expectations that come with their attitude of shame and culture is just overwhelming. And that's the truth. It's so overwhelming that a lot of people feel like death is the option, because what other option is there? That's a lot of people's thinking, and I have a lot of sympathy for that. A lot of sympathy. It may be wrong, but there's a lot of sympathy considering um, how soul crushing that that kind of mentality is brought upon people. But what the book of Mark here in this story is telling us is that Jesus is able Jesus is able to free us from that, just to heal us from that soul crushing experience. But you have to believe that Jesus can do that. You have to believe that Jesus is not only do you have to believe that Jesus can do it, you have to be believing that Jesus is willing to do it. Otherwise, you'll just continually feel that soul crushing pressure. And that's why I think a lot of people have that sense of hopelessness in the world today. Is because since so many people have disregarded God, well, there is nothing that's going to help you with that soul crushing pressure. Because only God can do that. That's what I believe, is only God can do that. But if we disregard God, then that soul crushing pressure will destroy you. And that was something that both Jairus and the woman with the hemorrhage, that's something they had to deal with. They had to deal with like, well, this is what is expected of me through society. But now there's this Jesus guy who can bring healing to that. Can I believe in that? Can I trust that enough? And can I trust it more than what I've always known in my shame and honor culture? And so I think that's why these two stories were tied together. And brilliantly so. Because there's also within that story, there's the contrast, right? There's the synagogue leader would be someone of high social standing, whereas the woman would have been like a nobody. And remember, because of her whole unmarriageable thing, she would have been viewed less than nothing. She would have been viewed as like a huge societal liability. And that's part of what the Bible implied when it said that she had suffered under like doctors and healers for years. Is that she was, by not being able to have them help her, she was constantly being reminded that she was a liability to her society. And that's a shitty feeling for anyone. I think that's why, um, you know, the irony is that in North America we've reversed it, where like a lot of men now have this feeling because men are not the traditional providers like they used to be in a lot of situations, and so they feel like they're a liability to society, which is where you get like incel culture and stuff like that. men are treated like a liability. And that's a shitty feeling. Nobody should ever feel like they're a liability to, those around them. And that's also why, like, once again, suicide rates are so high. People often can easily feel like they're just bringing everyone else down. And I'm pretty sure everybody's had that feeling, because once again, nobody is perfect, let alone fully competent. Sorry, I worded that wrong. Nobody is fully competent, let alone perfect. So we don't even need to use the excuse that nobody's perfect. Nobody is even fully competent. So we all have those moments of failings. And with those failings comes that feeling of being a liability. And that's something that is rough for anyone. And I think that's the interesting thing about the woman in the story, is that she's the liability of her society, and then you have the religious leader who would have been the upper echelon of society. Well, relatively, because remember, they're all slaves to Romans. But within the Jewish religious culture, he would have been viewed as like higher up. You get the point, though. It's basically like the two ends. But for Jesus, that doesn't matter. For Jesus, he's compassionate to all people. And that is, of course, one of the major appeals of Christianity compared to, well, basically every other religion. Before, like, a lot of people have the wrong ideas about this, where it's like, well, because part of it was colonialism did leave a bad taste, but Christianity is way older than colonialism, so there's that too. Well, they rephrase it. Depends on, when I say colonialism, I obviously mean like European, because I guess there's other forms of colonialism that's older than Christianity, like the Roman Empire, and basically any empire that existed before Jesus. They count as, I mean, every society that has been a conqueror technically is a colonizer, if you wanted to be technical about it. But anyway, that's besides the point. Jesus, he doesn't care about social status. Grace, mercy, healing, those are something that anyone can access through belief in Jesus Christ. And that is kind of one of the major, I mean, every pastor's probably made that point when it comes to this chapter in Mark chapter 5. And I'm going to make it too, because it's kind of like the it's the most obvious point. But it just really shows like that compassionate nature of Jesus. Just to speed things up, because I can't believe we've only done chapter 5 in 2 hours. So Jesus goes to the Jairus' house, and he raises this guy's daughter from the dead, because she supposedly died on their way there. And so Jesus raises her from the dead. And it's funny because Jesus after she's raised from the dead, Jesus just like he tells the people like something practical. He goes like, no need to make a big deal out of this. All right? Just get the girl some food and carry on with our days. And there's a funny thing where like this story has one of those moments. There's a lot of these moments in the book of Luke. And this is where like you get the Christian rhetoric about like Jesus being fully human, where like there's some moments where Jesus is just very nonchalant on like kind of being lazy because that's just a human thing to do, of like, yeah, this, I don't want to make this a big deal. It's just like Jesus has a number of those moments. The book of Luke has a lot of them where Jesus is kind of like, I don't want to deal with this. I'm too lazy for this. This is too early in the morning for this crap. And Jesus has a lot of those moments. And this is one of those moments where Jesus kind of like, no need we don't want to make a big deal out of it. We make a big deal out of it, there will be like tons of word and gossip and stuff like that. And I'm too lazy to deal with that. So let's just do something simple. No need to make a big deal out of this girl being healed. Just give her some food and just carry on with your day. Let's just treat it like a no big deal. I always thought that was kind of humorous. Because like once again, Jesus just like raised the girl from the dead, but Jesus treats it like it's no big deal. It's other little things too, where I I think now take what I say with a grain of like take what I say here with a lot of salt, not just a grain, but like a lot of salt here, where I think that's the interesting contrast here, where the miracle itself is kind of downplayed because it's not really the heart of who Jesus is. Jesus isn't about like the fancy miracles, because this is one of his more like powerful ones, if you will, when he raises somebody from the dead. But the miracle is the less important part of the story, and it's played off when Jesus kind of like just treat it like a normal thing, just get the girl something to eat and carry on with our days. So the miracle isn't the focus on Jesus's character, it is Jesus's compassion and mercy, which is the whole thing with Jairus and the other woman with the hemorrhage. And I think that's something that, if I may be so bold, that's the thing that most people miss when they talk about who Jesus is. It's not about the, I mean, okay, there's the whole resurrection being like the most important miracle and the foundation of Christianity. But as far as when we talk about like other stuff Jesus generally did, the miracles are not viewed to be that important. And I made this whole discourse in the book of Luke that the more important thing is who Jesus is, his kindness, his compassion, his love for people, his ability to look past shame and honor. That's who Jesus is. The miracles are cool and all, but any, think of it this way, any miracle, I mentioned this in the book of Acts discourse, but any miracle that Jesus or his disciples ever did was never about being flashy for the sake of being, of drawing attention. But the purpose of all miracles was to show God's compassion and kindness and God's love. And that's why, Christians make it a big deal about how we are to be kind and compassionate to others. We are meant to be the face of God, if you will, to people. We are meant to, and that's what it means to be a Christian or little Christ, is that we are to imitate Jesus. And that's why you hear, the letters of Paul have that whole discourse of like the church being the body of Christ, is because we are meant to emulate those qualities of Jesus. The more important stuff that the Gospels care more about than the miracles themselves. It's the compassion, the kindness, the love, joy, peace, etc. All those things. That is what we are meant to embody a lot more than the flashy miracles. Not to say that those things don't happen, but they're not that important, which I know is a bold statement to make, but the miracles are not that important at the end of the day, because you can see like God heal people in the most crazy of ways, but the most important things are when people are led to belief in Christ and become followers of him. Those are the real miracles. And that was one of the things when I used to volunteer in the Vancouver slums. That was where like the power of the gospel, that's how I saw the power of the gospel, was seeing like people like my buddy Jamal being healed. Not in, physical ways as well. Being free from drugs will do that. But that spiritual healing of people people coming to faith in God and then rebuilding lives and seeing people's lives change through the power of the gospel. Like those are the real miracles that matter. That's where we see that inner character of Jesus, the kindness, the compassion, the love of Jesus. And that's a major theme in chapter 5 of Mark. Oh, chapter 6 is really long. I know in the description I said we do chapter 5 and 6, but I think I'm gonna backpedal on that because This ended up being like chapter 5 plus Shame and Honor podcast, but we're just gonna call it Mark chapter 5 today. And it's already been 2.5 hours, so we're gonna end the stream here actually. I'm gonna do a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, go ahead and shoot. We'll try and cover some Q&A for like the next 10 minutes if possible. Like if you have that many questions, I'll only go up to 10 minutes. But we got a little bit of housekeeping. So next week, as far as streams are concerned, we're gonna have the 2 Unicorn Overlord streams on Monday and Thursday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. And we will read Mark chapter 6 and probably just chapter 6. I just realized chapter 6 is pretty long. And it's got all the more spectacular stories in it, which is the reason why I wanted to do 5 and 6 together was because you're supposed to contrast the character of Jesus with the more spectacular side of Jesus. But we'll just have fun with some of the spectacular the more spectacular stories of Jesus. We'll have some fun with that next week and talk about that. So we might just do 1 chapter next week, which means that the Mark playlist is going to be longer than 8 videos. Because my original plan was just to do like 8 pairs, because the book Mark only goes up to chapter 16. But I guess that plan is out the window now. But that's okay. I don't mind just having Mark be a longer series. Because I don't plan to, like, I don't know what I'm going to read after Mark, that's for sure. I might just do another Paul letter or something, and then even then that's not going to be that long. So as far as 2024 is concerned, there's not going to be that many, like, quote-unquote Bible reading series. We'll just do, like, 2 books, maybe. If Mark already takes 10 weeks. So, at least. Who knows? I hope it doesn't happen, but, like, I don't want, like, every single week to be, like, 1 chapter. Even though, once again, like, I could easily turn it into that, but I'll try to avoid that in the future. But anyway, next week, next Friday, we'll do Mark chapter 6 by itself. So that's next week for sure for streams. I don't know if I will have a new D4 DJ video next week. There's not gonna be one this week because I had the one last week, and I'm gonna try to make it relatively bi-weekly. But that's already proving to be pretty hard. So maybe D4 DJ video next week. I don't know. No promises on that. The reason why I can't promise you that I'm not even close to finishing the script yet. But I still have the 3 other videos. Definitely check them out if you haven't seen them already. And yeah, so next week 3 streams, maybe a video if I somehow power through it well enough. But I am doubting myself. I don't think that's gonna happen. So just how it is. But with that said, I will see you guys on Monday at 2 o'clock Pacific time for Unicorn Overlord. Until then, I hope you guys have a great Friday night. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will see you guys Monday. God bless you, and take care of yourselves.